Good evening. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Andrew Graybill, and I'm a professor of history and the director of the William P. Clement Center for Southwest Studies here at SMU. I want to start by thanking the many folks who've helped make this evening possible, starting with our good pals at the Center for Presidential History, with whom we are co-sponsoring tonight's event. Especially want to thank Rana Spitz, who's in the back there, who, along with our own Ruth Ann Elmore, has coordinated all the logistics for this evening. Seems that folks are trickling in late. I'm always happy to see something approximating a full house, but if you want to scoot in, if you see folks who are sort of standing around the margins, do the whole sort of Sunday church thing and move to the middle. Thank you. So in August 2018, I opened up the Sunday New York Times and I found a hefty magazine inside. Mercifully, it was not one of the Times' periodic and glossy fashion or travel specials. Those I simply cannot recycle fast enough. Instead, it was that week's New York Times Magazine, except it wasn't standard. Rather, for the first time in its history, the magazine devoted its entire issue to a single story by one of their writers at large, Nathaniel Rich. So I found his article by turns utterly fascinating and deeply depressing, all captured in the argument, which in his words is this, quote, "By 1979, we knew nearly everything we understand today about climate change, including how to stop it. Over the next decade, a handful of scientists, politicians, and strategists risked their careers in a desperate, escalating campaign to convince the world to act before it was too late." It's interesting, that kind of rings true on a different issue, the present moment. Alas, we know how the story has turned out, at least so far, with yet another reminder dropping just 2 days ago when the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that 2019 is almost certain to rank as the second or third hottest year on record. Given my own sort of strange and perpetually disconcerting preoccupation with climate change, I thought Mr. Rich was somebody we simply had to bring to Dallas. So I'd like to introduce him to you. Nathaniel Rich grew up in Manhattan and attended Yale University, graduating in 2002. He now makes his home in New Orleans. He's the author of 3 novels, King Zero, Odds Against Tomorrow, and The Mayor's Tongue. He has published short fiction pieces in venues such as McSweeney's, Vice, and The American Scholar, and 2 of his stories were finalists for the National Magazine Award for Fiction. He's presently a writer-at-large for the New York Times Magazine, and he writes about literature and film for such publications as The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Review of Books. He was fiction editor of the Paris Review from 2005 to 2010. Now, he has 2 particularly exciting recent developments. The first of these is the birth this summer of his second child, Mazel Tov. And then there's a national release this Friday, November 22nd, of Dark Waters, a movie starring the awesome Mark Ruffalo, which is based on one of Nathaniel's articles for the New York Times Magazine, which focuses on the efforts of a crusading corporate defense attorney who has a change of heart and decides to play his part in trying to stop the use of certain chemicals that are used in Teflon products. Nathaniel Rich is here tonight, of course, to discuss his latest book, Losing Earth, A Recent History, which is his most significant foray yet into the world of nonfiction. Following his lecture, he'll be happy to take your questions and afterwards to sign books, which are available for purchase just outside. I'd ask that you buy the books outside and then come back in here to have them signed so that we can have something approximating traffic flow. So please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Rich.
Thank you all. If you guys are looking for some seats, there's some over here, not to make everyone look at you. Thank you, Professor Graybill, for asking me here, and to the Center for Presidential History for hosting me. It's really an honor to be here with you. Thank you all for coming today when there's so many political entertainments competing for your attention. I thought with a politically minded, presidentially minded crowd, it might be tough to get people to come out, so I'm really thrilled that you all are here. And this is my first day I've ever spent in Dallas somehow. I've already sat in George W.'s chair in the Oval Office. So I feel, the replica Oval Office, so I feel welcomed into this community already. So Professor Graybill asked me earlier how I came to write about climate change, and it's a good question. I'm the author of 3 novels, as he said, and I write narrative nonfiction for the New York Times Magazine. So I didn't come to this as a science journalist or an environmentalist. I didn't choose to write about climate change out of a desire to do good or to save the world. Although as someone who intends to be alive for a few more decades, the horrors that are coming for us do feel very personal to me. And it's something I've thought a lot about in my own personal life. I came to write about climate change instead out of a frustration that the story wasn't being told accurately or told well. There is, after all, no more pressing, more encompassing matter before us. It touches every aspect of our lives and our futures and our politics. Yet it has tended to be written about and spoken about publicly in a minor key. Like any common narrative, it succumbed to tropes and cliches. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'd characterize the basic template for climate journalism as something like this. Here's a shocking new catastrophe. President Trump is dropping out of the Paris Accord, rolling back a regulation, nominating an industry hack to the cabinet. This is a big problem because if we don't limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, some terrifying things will soon come to pass. But already the harbingers of an apocalypse are with us: wildfires, drought, superstorms. The great political and economic powers that be are aligned against us: the oil and gas industry, campaign finance law, the Republican Party, capitalism itself. Yet there's still time to avoid the worst if only we take action now: punish Exxon, protest, vote. Now, most, if not all of this is true. I don't take issue with any of it, really. But it's remarkable how consistent the message is. It's powered by an activist impulse which, simplified, would read, "It's not too late if only we act now." This is true too. But is it the whole story? I don't think it is, which is why I decided to write about the decade between 1979 and 1989, when the fundamental scientific questions were already settled and attention turned from diagnosis of the problem to solutions. It was also, critically, a time before the oil and gas industry had consolidated behind a strategy of disinformation and political bribery. During this decade, major figures on both the left and the right made strong, good faith efforts to push for action, well before denialism became a central tenet of mainstream national republicanism. It was, in other words, a time not only before our current political paralysis had taken hold, but before the public conversation had undergone its own form of paralysis. Over the course of 2 years, I read everything I could find about the period: academic theses, newspaper articles, congressional testimony, government reports. I visited archives and interviewed more than 100 sources, former senators and congressional staffers, glaciologists and cloud physicists, industry operatives, journalists, psychologists, economists. The most startling thing I found was that every single conversation we're having in 2019 about climate change was being held nearly verbatim in 1979. I don't mean only the predictions about degrees of warming and sea level rise. Indeed, the scientific consensus on these issues hasn't budged in these 40 years. But I also found in 1979 and the early 80s the same conversations we're having now about speculative carbon removal technologies, the need for to help developing nations modernize without resorting to massive fossil fuel consumption, and the cost-benefit analyses that always seem to favor inaction. In the end, I focused on the 2 people I felt were most responsible for moving the issue forward during those years, for nearly convincing the US, and with it, the world, to take action while there was still time: an environmental lobbyist named Rafe Pomerantz and the NASA scientist James Hansen. Their campaign can be broken down into 3 phases. In the first, from 1979 to 1981, They believed that it would be enough simply to share what they knew, that the magnitude of the threat would force prudent officials to act. So James Hansen published his disturbing findings in major scientific journals, and he gave interviews to national reporters. On August 22, 1981, a front-page article in the New York Times reported on a study by Hansen, finding that in the past century, the world had already begun to warm. Most strikingly, the study made a policy recommendation. This got him in a lot of trouble with his bosses at NASA. In the coming decades, Hansen wrote, the U.S. should try to phase out use of fossil fuels. Meanwhile, Rafe Pomerantz organized a series of high-level meetings in various branches of the federal government, including the EPA, the Department of Energy, the National Security Council, and Jimmy Carter's White House. In these meetings, he teamed up with Gordon MacDonald, who's a fascinating figure, a chief scientist for the CIA and a senior advisor to Richard Nixon, who explained the nature of the threat and demanded major political action. When their warnings failed, they took their case to the public, largely through congressional hearings. Hansen began appearing before Congress in 1981, and he would do so nearly every year in that decade. Al Gore, then a junior congressman from Tennessee, called hearings in the House, and later a trio of Republican senators, David Dernberger of Minnesota, John Chafee, Rhode Island, and Robert Stafford of Vermont, called major hearings in the Senate. Around this time, a formal solution to the carbon dioxide crisis materialized, modeled after the UN's successful ozone treaty. At the signing of the Montreal Protocol in 1987, Reagan's own EPA Secretary, Lee Thomas, told reporters that a treaty to solve global warming would be next. Sensing an advantage, Hansen, Pomerantz, and their allies turned to their most urgent rhetoric yet, a campaign of public shaming. This reached its apotheosis during the summer of 1988, the hottest on record at the time. I don't know if it's in the top 20 at this point, when Hansen told Congress to stop waffling and take action. Even George H.W. Bush, running for president, championed the issue. Quote, "Those who think we are powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect," he said, "are forgetting about the White House effect." His running mate emphasized the ticket's commitment to the issue at the vice presidential debate. "The greenhouse effect is an important environmental issue," said Dan Quayle. "We need to get on with it, and in a George Bush administration, you can bet that we will." A week before the election, barnstorming in Alabama, Bush interrupted a speech on space exploration with a mournful reflection on global warming and the fate of the Earth. Summoning his inner Aldo Leopold, he said, "I recall the old fisherman's prayer, 'The sea is so large, Lord, and my boat is so small.' We face the prospect of being trapped on a boat we've irreparably damaged, not by the cataclysm of war, but by the slow neglect of a vessel we believe to be impervious to our abuse." He was running to the left of Dukakis on this issue, who was embracing coal. 2 weeks after the election, Bush was visited in the White House by former presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. They presented him with the American Agenda, a bipartisan report on the challenges facing the nation. It recommended making climate change a top national priority and doubling the EPA's research budget. Americans, the former presidents said, should no longer see environmental issues simply as a luxury. A lawyer for the Senate Energy Committee told an industry journal then that lawmakers were, quote, frightened by Bush's commitment to the issue. He predicted that Congress would pass significant legislation once he took office. A lot of people on the Hill see the greenhouse effect as the issue of the 1990s, a gas lobbyist told Oil and Gas Journal, which was an excellent source for me. The coal industry, which had the most to lose from restrictions on carbon emissions, had already moved beyond denial to acceptance. The National Coal Association acknowledged that the greenhouse effect was no longer, quote, an emerging issue. It is here already, and we'll be hearing more and more about it. By the end of 1988, 32 climate bills had been introduced in Congress, led by 2 bipartisan omnibuses, more ambitious in many aspects than even the most lofty goals of what's now being called the Green New Deal. Instead of calling for the end of carbon emissions, or the phase out of carbon emissions, the 1988 bills pushed to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down to levels not seen since the 1950s. The bills promoted nuclear power and an issue that's now taboo across the political spectrum, population control. At a meeting of oil executives shortly after the election, Wyoming Congressman Dick Cheney declared that a gasoline tax would, quote, be very difficult to fend off. It was at this moment, when the environmental movement was, in the words of one energy lobbyist, on a tear, that Bush invited the UN's newly created Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to hold one of its first sessions at the State Department. We can probably not afford to wait until all of the uncertainties about global climate change have been resolved before we act, said James Baker in the very first speech he gave after being confirmed as Secretary of State. Time will not make the problem go away. That, in retrospect, was the high point of a global climate partnership. After Baker's speech, he received a visit from John Sununu, Bush's chief of staff. Quote, "Stay clear of this greenhouse effect nonsense," Sununu told Baker. "You don't know what you're talking about." Baker never mentioned the subject again. All year, while the president remained aloof, Sununu waged a furious battle against William Riley, the head of Bush's EPA, who pushed strongly for a treaty to reduce emissions. Sununu, who had received a PhD in mechanical engineering, had developed conspiratorial theories about the appropriation of scientific theories to further what he considered a socialistic anti-growth doctrine. He questioned the science to an extent that at the time was largely unheard of, and he won over powerful administration allies. All through that year, President Bush's rhetoric, public rhetoric, vacillated between his advisors' positions, depending on whom he had spoken to last or who wrote his last speech. This set the stage for a dramatic clash in the Netherlands in November of 1989, 30 years ago last week, at the first high-level diplomatic meeting convened by the IPCC. It was expected that the world's environmental ministers, for the first time, would endorse the target proposed by their host, the Dutch minister, to freeze greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels. It didn't happen. Last week, following the publication in the Netherlands of Losing Earth, and for this anniversary, the TV program NewsHour, which is something like, has been explained to me, the Dutch 2020, ran a documentary about the Noordwijk, they also corrected my pronunciation, Noordwijk conference. They interviewed Rafe Pomerantz, who attended the conference, and William Riley, among others. And I want to interrupt my talk here just to show you a 5-minute clip, since the producers not only did an excellent job of reporting the story, but they found in their archives, in their private film archives, a bunch of incredible footage that I wish I'd known about and had access to in the writing of the book. So I'm going to do that now. So that last line that he recited is essentially John Sununu's line, and was the excuse that was given at the time. And in these interviews, and as he did in interviews he had with me, Riley talks about this as the greatest failure of his professional life. So the short version basically is Sununu and his allies, the science advisor Alan Bromley, forced the IPCC to drop its plans for a binding treaty. If you have questions about the internal battle that was waged within the White House between Sununu and Riley during that whole year, I'd be happy to go into greater detail. It's the subject of much of the final section of Losing Earth, afterwards, I should say. So in retrospect, it's clear that this marks the closest we've come to slowing this behemoth of climate change. The same year, the American petroleum industry and Exxon each released internally their own white papers outlining the strategy they would use to fight back against the proposed climate legislation. They both papers agreed on 3 principles: that the industry should be an active participant in any policy debate, that it should emphasize uncertainty in the science where it existed, which is a far cry from its later strategy of declaring the fundamental science uncertain, and that it would refuse to endorse any policy or legislation that might hurt its bottom line. So that's the very beginning. That's 88, 89. As part of this strategy, the American Petroleum Institute began to recruit scientists who could be relied upon to question the science in public forums, paying them $2,000 for publishing op-eds in national publications. That was the beginning of professional climate denialism, but as we know, this public relations strategy succeeded far beyond its original authors' expectations. I was the first person to report the existence of these white papers and to speak with their authors, so that's something else I'm happy to expand upon if anyone is interested later on. In the years that followed, climate policy became an afterthought, then a casualty of the Republican Party's delirious embrace of industry propaganda, until now, when it's become merely a matter of life and death. So why did we fail then, when so many of the obstacles now in our way had yet to present themselves? The narrow political answer is John Sununu, but it's hardly a satisfying answer. It raises instead a different question. Why was public support so weak that it took a single naysayer within the administration, albeit one who held considerable power, to blow up the prospect of a binding global treaty? In my research, I learned that a small but active group of social scientists had debated since the mid-1970s whether a human solution to this human problem was even possible. Whether they came at the question from the realms of political science or economics or psychology, they tended to conclude that human beings did not have sufficient reverence for the long-term future to motivate the level of immediate transformational change required to solve the climate crisis. Adaptation, as the philosopher Klaus Meyer-Abich concluded in 1980, seems to be the most rational political option. It's the option that we've pursued, consciously or not, ever since. A major difference today is that a solution is now in hand, many solutions, in fact. They all tend to involve some combination of carbon pricing, renewable energy investment, reforestation, improved agricultural techniques, nuclear power, and building machines capable of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. James Hansen has developed his own proposal, these tend to be called roadmaps, which runs a decade, arrests climate change, and saves trillions of dollars for the global economy. As the economist William Nordhaus said upon winning the Nobel Prize last year, the problem is political rather than one of economics or feasibility. You should know, besides being one of the first economists in the mid-1970s to study the costs and benefits of climate policy, he was called upon to brief George Bush HW's cabinet on the issue during this critical time. He's also a major, he's read in the higher echelons of API, I was told. So we can trust the technology and the economics. It's harder to trust human behavior. Al Gore told me, from the first time I got involved with the issue until now, the central problem has always been that the maximum considered politically feasible still falls short of the minimum required to be efficacious. Confronted with that gap, you have two options. One is to curl up into a fetal position and fall into despair. The other is to develop a strategy for expanding the limits of what is politically feasible. What is politically feasible? I do think any discussion of the issue needs to take into account our reluctance to face squarely long-term threats, especially those that are existential in nature. But we have solved, or at least endeavored much more seriously to solve, social crises before, some of them existential in nature, or at least perceived that way at the time. When popular movements have transformed public opinion in a brief amount of time, they've done so on the strength of a moral claim that persuades enough voters to see the issue in human rather than purely political terms. We don't hesitate to speak in such terms about the other great issues of the day: racial injustice, gun violence, immigration, sexual assault, even the accelerating rate of mechanization. If we speak about climate as only a political issue, it will suffer the fate of all political issues. If we speak about it as only an economic issue, it will suffer the fate of all economic issues submitted to cost-benefit analysis. The first requirement is to speak about the problem honestly, as a struggle for survival. Now, any consideration of the moral dimension of the climate crisis must begin with those whose morality could only be described as sociopathic, those who've tried to bewitch an unassuming public with uncertainty and denialism. The rot extends, however, beyond the most cartoonish forms of denialism, the re-education videos sent to elementary schools, the statements beginning, "I'm not a scientist, but..." The failure to acknowledge the problem is itself a form of denialism, a gaslighting by omission. The moderator of a presidential debate, I guess we'll check in later tonight, who fails to pose a single question about climate change, the editor who fails to assign articles because there's no immediate news peg, believing that a perpetual threat is not sufficiently newsy, the school board that limits discussion of climate change to biology classes because it seems too political, all make their own humble contributions to the thickening of the public ignorance. It's not yet widely understood, though it will be, that the politician who claims that climate change is uncertain betrays humanity in the same fashion as the politician who fabricates weapons of mass destruction in order to whip up support for a war. It's not yet widely understood, though it will be, that when a government relaxes emissions regulations or erases scientific data from a federal website, it's guilty of more than merely bowing to corporate interests. It commits crimes against humanity. The rejection of reason, the molten core of denialism, opens the door to the rejection of morality, for morality relies on a shared faith in reason. Once it becomes possible to disregard the welfare of future generations or those now vulnerable to flooding or drought or wildfire, once it becomes possible to abandon the constraints of human empathy, any monstrosity committed in the name of self-interest is permissible. The greatest trick of the professional denialists is not to convince the world that global warming is a hoax. The world remains unconvinced. Even 3/4 of the US public is unconvinced. The denialists' greatest trick is to convince us that they are convinced, that they really believe what they say. But with few exceptions, and I actually think John Sununu is one, he's a complicated guy, they don't. Observe their carefully phrased evasions, spoken in the defiant tones of the paid spokesperson, the bully, the flat earther. Statements like, "I believe man has an impact on the climate, but what is not completely understood is what the impact is." That's from sworn congressional testimony by Andrew Wheeler, the former coal lobbyist who now runs the EPA. Or, "Something's changing and it'll change back again." That's Trump, but it's really that's an old chestnut. Or, "The data are mixed." That's Senator Ted Cruz. Are exactly as honest as the claims that cutting taxes on the rich will help the poor or that cigarettes aid digestion. The denialist doesn't care about winning a war of ideas, only about avoiding the appearance of amorality. If the science is uncertain, inaction is blameless. Against such rhetoric, reasoned arguments are self-defeating. They only help to shuttle the discourse out of the furnace of moral reckoning and into the arid corridors of a policy debate. A human problem requires a human solution. One of our most effective weapons is mortal shame. Now, shame may have no influence on the handymen of industry, but an appeal to higher decency can work on the human beings who vote in elections. They're still, after all, human beings. The cost-benefit analysis is rapidly shifting. The distant perils of climate change are no longer very distant. Many now occur regularly, flagrantly. But natural disasters alone will not revolutionize public opinion in the remaining time allotted to us. It's not enough to appeal to narrow self-interest. Narrow self-interest, after all, is how we got here. Tens of millions of Americans who have no reason to believe that flames are licking at their patio doors or that flood waters are overtaking their front porch must still be moved to demand a full transformation of our energy system, our economy, ourselves. This transformation of public opinion can only begin at the moment of repugnance that follows a clear-eyed reckoning with what we've done and what we continue to do. This brings me back to the question of how we write about climate change. We're well acquainted by now with the political story of climate change, the technological story, the economic story, the industry story. They've been told expertly and exhaustively by journalists and scholars. They're all critical to understanding how we got here. But what about the human story? How do we live with the knowledge that the future will be far less hospitable to human civilization than the present? Should we obsess over this knowledge, ignore it, find some tense middle territory? Will future generations be satisfied with the justifications we offer for inaction? Even as we consider solutions today, how do we make sense of our failures to this point? And how do we make sense of our own complicity, however reluctant, in this nightmare? In the US, spiritual leaders have been divided on the significance of climate change, but the most eloquent attempt to articulate a moral vision of the issue has come from Pope Francis. In his second encyclical, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, the Pope calls on every living person to repent for the ecological damage we've contributed, quote, smaller or greater, to the disfigurement and destruction of creation. For human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. The Pope writes that we must look for solutions not only in technology, but in a change of humanity. Otherwise, we would be dealing merely with symptoms. Until now, we've tried to deal merely with symptoms. We've had about as much success in treating the cancer of global warming as might any oncologist permitted to deal merely with the symptoms. We all have a stake in this, but our individual stakes are not equally allotted, not yet. The relationship between those who've burned the most fossil fuels and those who will suffer the most from a warming climate is perversely inverted. The inversion is both chronological, younger generations pay for their elders' emissions, and socioeconomic, the poor suffer what the rich deserve. The greatest victims will be the poorest people in the world, particularly those in nations that have not enjoyed the benefits of industrial energy consumption, and particularly those who do not have white skin. It was the world's island nations who began years ago to make a moral plea for action. We cannot accept that any island be lost to sea level rise, said James Michel, president of the Seychelles, in 2014, ahead of that year's IPCC summit. We do not have the economic means to build sophisticated defenses, he said, but we have something that is powerful. We are the conscience of these negotiations. We stand as the defenders of the moral rights of every citizen of our planet. A year later, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands called the forced abandonment of their homes because of climate change and sea level rise, quote, equivalent to genocide. In the last year, the young leaders demanding action have spoken in the same register as the leaders of the sinking island nations. It's the language of civil rights, of social justice. You hear it in the speeches of the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who told the world leaders at Davos, I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to panic. You hear it from the youth plaintiffs of our children's trust, an organization suing the US government for accelerating climate change despite understanding the stakes since the Johnson administration. Last month, the lead plaintiff, Kelsey Juliana, now in college, all the plaintiffs were under 21 at filing, said on the steps of the Supreme Court, we're asking those individuals who are putting guns to the foreheads of all youth to remove your weapon. And you heard it during the climate strikes a few weeks ago when protesters said things like, your complacency is killing me, and you will die of old age, we will die of climate change. These young activists have absorbed a critical lesson from the past 40 years. They've learned that patient, rational argument has its political limitations. Moral pressure must be applied. The cruel inversions of climate change extend even to Earth's wealthiest nations. Climate change disadvantages the disadvantaged, oppresses the oppressed, discriminates against the discriminated against. In the longer term, though, we all become impoverished. An underexamined worst-case scenario is the violence done to our belief in a shared humanity. The failure to act erodes our trust in human fellowship as it does our glaciers. After another generation of willful neglect, Who will be able to take seriously the fundamental ideals like egalitarianism or fraternity or liberty claimed as the basis for democracy? Our collective failure to respond to the crisis, Pope Francis has written, reflects, quote, the loss of that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded. There can be no civil society without a stable climate. There can be no stable climate without a civil society. The fight to preserve one is the same as the fight to preserve the other. There can be no future unless it's understood that our future will be commonly shared. Everything is changing about the natural world, and everything must change about the way we conduct our lives. We'll ultimately summon the will to take decisive action. The question is whether we do so because the suffering is already so flagrant that there's simply no other choice, or whether we will begin more quickly to call the threats to our future what they are. Will we excuse me, will we learn from our failures, or will we use them as a justification to succumb to inertia? If we are to learn from them, we'll have to understand that when we talk about things like, say, gasoline taxes or fuel efficiency standards, or even the Paris Treaty, we're speaking about nothing less than the fate of all we are and all we love. Thank you. So it's a complicated, big story, so I wanted to leave enough time for questions. Yes, sir. Is there a microphone?
We have microphones.
Okay.
I already have a rather immediate problem with climate change. I don't need to be convinced of the science. I'm not the only grandparent in this room. I have a grandson who just graduated from college. He's very interested in this topic. I'm very flattered that he thinks I know as much as he thinks I know, but I don't. So I'm going to turn it to you. What should I tell him about his personal planning, apart from his involvement in the broader issue? What should I say to him about his personal life, like where further studies, where to live? I mean, should he move to China? I mean, I don't know.
Right.
So you tell me what I ought to tell him.
Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me of when the original article was published. We did this big forum. The New York Times hosted this big forum in New York where James Hansen and Rafe Pomerantz and I were there in a conversation. And there's for me, a pretty shocking, upsetting moment when a young girl raised her hand, probably 9 years old, and she said, where should I live? Where can I? What is safe? Where is it safe to live? And Hansen, as this scientist, went into a very complicated explanation of longitude and latitude and all of that, and proximity to fresh water, and Rafe sort of echoed that, but what struck me was I felt that she was really asking a different question about how will you protect, why are the older people in this world not protecting us? Why don't we feel safe? And it's heartbreaking, and I think that is the kind of conversation that we really haven't had as a society yet in a public way. So yes, I'm also very curious about where I should live. I live in one of the cities most endangered by climate change in the world, New Orleans. But there are questions about, well, how do we make sense of our decisions to live where we are? How do we feel about, how do we think about our future? How do we think about our loved ones? I don't think there's one right answer to this. How do we feel safe, in other words? Is a question that I think all of us, and particularly young people, and particularly people in the future, will be asking ourselves. And those are difficult questions without really good answers, but they're questions that need to be asked. So my short version is the first thing that anyone can do, young or old, is to speak about the issue and speak about it frankly and openly and honestly. And that is hard to do a lot of the time. It's hard for me to do. It's hard to really stare at this thing head on. Every fiber of your being wants to just sort of minimize it, put it out of mind. And I do that as much as anyone else. Obviously, when I make decisions about where to buy a house or raise my children, I, to some extent, put it out of my mind. And yet, I think until we're honest with ourselves about it to a greater extent, then I don't think we're going to ever summon the effort necessary to do it. But in terms of, what cities to live, I mean, you want to be further north. You want to have access to water, probably groundwater. But yeah, and you want to vote, for people who would support those things. Okay, yes.
Thank you. I want to empower everyone in this room. I am a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a national nonpartisan organization working on a market-based solution to address this problem. And while individual action and reckoning with our own responsibility is very important, what we need is systemic solutions. And our North Texas volunteers just got back from Washington, D.C., where we met with all of the members of the North Texas congressional delegation on our bill for carbon pricing. And so I invite you to learn about this wonderful organization, Citizens Climate Lobby. It's bipartisan. We're Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. I would love to talk to you about the work that our North Texas chapter is doing to build support for a systemic solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
I just wanted to say I lived in Beijing for 2 years, and not too long ago. And what was fascinating that occurred there is when Angela Merkel would show up, they would shut down all the coal plants to clean the air.
Yeah.
But when they had the party Congress, they left them all on in the wintertime. And the reason was that Xi Jinping wanted to force their government to clean up the pollution that occurs in China. And while I was living there, I was involved in a number of projects with the Chinese government, and it was remarkable how serious they've taken it. They've now shut down all coal-fired power plants in the city of Beijing, which is huge, and their car emission standards are better than in the United States, and I could go on and on and on. They have a huge problem, but they are taking huge actions, and the Chinese that I know, that I still talk to over there in the government, say it's amazing to them that the U.S. is going in reverse, because they see this not only as something they have to do for their people, otherwise they will lose power, but they also see it as a massive economic opportunity, and the U.S. has now ceded all of the ground of all of the technology to China. And I was interested in your comment on that kind of global nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Chinese counterexample is fascinating for a number of reasons. They are far ahead of us in many ways. They also have surpassed us as the world's leading emitter of carbon emissions. And I think what's striking to me about it, and certainly the economic argument is there. That's mainstream economic thought now is that there's a benefit. All these policies are net positive economically for GDP and all the rest. So they have an argument there. What's striking to me about the Chinese example is that there's so much talk now about fears of not just in the U.S. but globally of this drift into a kind of right-wing authoritarianism, populist, fascist ideology. I wonder if we continue to go down this road in this country, regardless of what party is president, if there will be as strong of a push from the left for an authoritative government who can, like China, overnight radically change our energy system. You already see the stirrings of that now. It's muted because I think of who's in office and that and what's playing out on the political stage here. But I could imagine say you have a Democrat in office next, in 2020 or even 2024, and things are still not moving fast enough, I could easily see a popular movement of people who are terrified about climate demanding some kind of powerful, authoritative force from the left to take over, a dissatisfaction with the slow gear turning of democracy. But yes, that's something that hasn't even been really thought of or debated in this country yet. Sure.
I see, like we've all said, the importance of voting, but I also see the importance of voting with our wallets. So why has Amazon become so big? Why has the computer companies become so big? Because we have taken our dollars and we've purchased. So what can we do for the environment to have that same voting power with the pocketbook? Because, for example, if everybody put solar panels on the roof like we did, and we've been paying $8 a month for the last 3 years, how do we get more people to take their money out of their pockets and invest in the environment?
I think it's the same, it's part of the same conversation, it's part of the ethical conversation about it, about the subject. I mean, I went to, when this book was published in France, I went there and spoke with a bunch of reporters and environmental activists, and it was stunning to me the degree to which the conversation was focused on personal choice. So the leading environmental activists were saying things that you haven't heard in this country since Jimmy Carter's sweater speech, which was basically, you need to sacrifice. If you're driving your car, 50 kilometers a week, you have to drive it 30, and you have to take the bus. And it was shocking for two reasons. One, in that it's so foreign to an American ear. Nobody, I mean, of course, if you're reading, Sierra Club magazine or something, they'll say, what can you do to reduce your footprint, all of that. But, and it's something people think about who are environmentally minded. But nobody on the left politically is saying we need sacrifice. Furthermore, I think the leading thinkers on the subject, on policy, will say, yes, we should all do what we can do and live, and make good choices, as we tell my 3-year-old. But nothing's going to change until there's a systemic, shifting of the politics and really of the energy system, which I think is a pretty persuasive argument. But I think there's a connection, which is that I don't think voters, the public, mainstream, voters, for lack of a better term, will support the kind of, or even talk about the kind of transformational policy that we need until there's a better grounding in the ethics of it. We don't have an ethics around climate change the way we even do around pollution. Like in the same way that you don't, go to the bathroom in the street or throw, if you're brought up well, you don't throw trash out of your window. I think we need to think in the same terms about what we eat, what we shop for, how we travel. And I think you need that in people's personal lives in a serious way before it trickles into the politics. And we need it quickly, yeah. Yes, ma'am. I can repeat what you say.
With the advent of the unconventional energy sources, and I'm talking about the U.S. becoming a leader in natural gas production, do you think that the rhetoric of the industry might change, since it might reduce the footprint of our country?
Well, the rhetoric of the industry has shifted. I mean, if you see any national advertisement for Exxon, it's all about green algae. And incredibly, even this week, I apologize, but the surviving, the Koch brothers, who are politically active, I don't remember David or Charles, but Charles, thank you, gave an interview where he jumped from essentially a history of funding to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, climate denialism for decades, to saying we need to reduce emissions, but it has to be done in a smart way. It's pretty shocking. And so, which is not to say that the actions match the rhetoric, but it's already become unpalatable, I think, even for people in the oil and gas industry, or coal, to pretend that this isn't going on anymore. So you're in this sort of strange reality where national, and I distinguish sort of national Republican spokespeople from what you see at the local level, because for instance in New Orleans or Louisiana even, where we're worried about coastal erosion and rising seas, you don't hear this from local Republican officials, but at the national level, they're still spouting these talking points that even the industry has abandoned, in many cases years ago. So yes, I think the rhetoric is changing, but if I don't trust their actions to change based on our history with them until they're compelled to do so.
I have a comment and then also a question. My observation has been that over time, I have seen, like in annual reports, that the stakeholders or the shareholders of a lot of corporations now are demanding. And I was wondering, as part of your study or your resources or whatever, were you tracking any of that?
Yeah.
Because, I'm seeing people saying, we want to see this. I'm seeing it even here in North Texas, where young people are saying, this new house I'm going to buy, is it LEED certified? And there's a whole new business that's developing around all of that. So.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to diminish what's happening. There's a tremendous amount of movement on these issues and growth in not just use of renewable energy, but in the technology and the cost of it. Yeah, and the cost of energy from renewable sources is now competitive, if not in most parts of the country, beats fossil fuel sources. There's a site, the Sabin Center, I think it's the Sabin Center for Environmental Law at NYU, is tracking every lawsuit, climate lawsuit, and there's, I'd say at least 100 on there, not all in various stages. Some against the U.S. government, some against these corporations. One of the major ones is the Rockefellers, major stakeholders at Exxon, which came out of Standard Oil, are suing the company along these lines. And there are a few other. There's another lawsuit against Exxon that, along these lines, basically saying, the value that you are claiming as the value of Exxon assumes that we will exploit all of the resources that are still in the ground that you own, that you have possession of. But if we do so, we know that will go way beyond carbon budget of any kind of world we'd want to live in. And so this is a form of fraud, essentially. So those kinds of things are being tried out legally, but they're not, none of these things are resolved at this point. I think we might have time for one or two. Yeah, one more? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Okay, you talked about sort of like the corruption of the political thing, and I imagine it's from maybe the oil industries, maybe corrupting our politicians and things like that. But could you also address where the origins of why the religious right is so antithetical to acknowledging climate change? And is there something in the belief system that is so viscerally antithetical to it, or have they also the leaders been corrupted by donations by the petrochemical, or has there been research why that is?
It's a good question. I guess I would hesitate to say uniformly the religious right is opposed. There are plenty of religious groups in this country that would be considered politically conservative that have come out in support of trying to solve this problem. There's a very strong religious, the Pope made it. There's a very strong religious argument you can make for preserving this earth that we've been given. There's also, frankly, a very strong conservative argument, and it was made in the early 80s by Republicans in Washington, a conservative argument for stewardship of the climate and of the earth. So I think some segments of the religious right certainly have been corrupted, but I would hesitate to paint it with a broad brush on that issue.
What about the belief system if it hasn't been corrupted? And I think what I perceive is what you just mentioned. They're more the exceptions than the rules. I mean,
that's.
I have very right-wing religious friends and acquaintances that deny climate change to the person.
I guess.
And what is it about acknowledging climate change is such a thorn in their side?
I think it's tied to the politicization of the evangelical right, to the extent that exists. I think it's important to understand that denialism is this top-down messaging strategy that came into existence at this very specific time, and it was policy written by people who I interviewed, and it's filtered down. But I think what I go back to is that politically is that this is not an issue in the same way that Democrats have not taken this issue seriously in terms of prioritizing it over other causes in the last couple decades. On the right, it's also not prioritized. It's not, I don't think it's a core belief in the same way that you might find about issues like abortion or maybe gun rights, things like that. It's not a core belief that the party has taken on and made it, party ideology. It's something that's come from the top down. So I don't think that it's clung to with the same intensity. My hope is that it's not as central as some of these other beliefs, and that as a result it can be budged, be separated a little bit from party ideology. And you've seen that happen in the last year. If you look at, I hesitate to rely on public polling, but that's what it showed, that even on the right, there's a huge amount of movement towards some kind of sensible way of addressing this among rank and file voters. Thank you again for coming. I'll be hanging around if you want to talk anymore.